Do you think seaweed is sexy? No? Perhaps this episode will change your mind. I speak with Rihanna from the Scottish Seaweed Industry Association about how seaweed is making a comeback. I hear about court cases with seaweed, the future uses of seaweed, such as making t-shirts, and much more. At the end, you may even think about starting your own seaweed farm, perhaps, and we talk about that too, so you can find out more. Thanks so much for listening to Coastal Catch-Ups, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.
It's all about Marie and the coastal sea, aquatic life and everything in between. So sit on down and take a seat. Coastal Catch-Ups with Sam P.
Rihanna, thank you so much for coming on the Coastal Catch-Ups. How are you doing?
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, I'm doing great, thanks.
Good, good. I was wondering if you could start by giving myself and the listeners a brief overview of your career to date.
Oh, sure. I mean, I won't go into detail about, the various pubs that I worked at or random jobs that I've taken, being a baker at Waitrose. But I, with regards to seaweed anyway, I did my master's back over in Sweden back in 2017. And that was on the history of environmental sciences. So I did mine and focused on seaweed in the British Isles. And then I came back to the UK, worked for Mara Seaweed for a bit, who are now Seaweed Enterprises, and then ended up starting up the Seaweed Academy at SAMS, and now I'm the Business Development Manager for the Scottish Seaweed Industry Association, or the SSIA for short.
Good. So you said about skipping over your past careers, but I did see you were a chef at one point.
Yeah.
I thought I'd make the link there between the new seaweed industry and recipes, I suppose, in people. Is that experience came into play at all in your?
Yeah, actually, it's funny. So I did do a bit of chefing when I was a student. I ended up catering for student dinners. Because in Sweden, I don't know how much you know about the culture there, but it's very focused around student dinners. There's a different one every single week. And so I ended up being a chef part-time. And then I ran the pubs over the summers as well. So I was the head chef at the pub over 2 consecutive summers. And yeah, a couple of times people did say, let's do a seaweed themed dinner and have a student dinner that's all about seaweed. And I said, well, that would be great, but the seaweed isn't there. I can't go out and, we weren't right next to the beach, so I couldn't go collect it and cook with it. And equally, health and safety then wouldn't have been carried out properly. So I'd have to buy it. And seaweed at the moment is very niche. It's artisanal. If you're cooking with it, we did have an event at Sam's not long after I joined, so we did a launch of the Seaweed Academy, and I went to the local university, well, actually the college, so Argyle College, and I asked them to put together a menu that was all about seaweed. And the kids at first, they went, oh, what, why? What are we going to do with this? But then it ended up being a sort of gastronomical adventure. They made carrageenan cheesecake, they made dulse and haggis purses, they made these little mussel plates with seaweed in them, and shortbreads with seaweed, and it was just really exciting to see it. And by the end of it, they said this was a great challenge, and they had a great time. So yeah, it's the ongoing difficulty of how do we actually get it in the Western diet, because everyone thinks seaweed, they think sushi, and there's more to it.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that. But so if we take a step at the very start of your seaweed journey, why seaweed? Is there anything in particular about it that's grabbed your fascination? Could you share that with us?
Yeah, so I really wanted to find something. I think, like a lot of people, there's such a sense of despair at the moment in the world, and you just want to find something that's actually doing good. you know. And I was really focused on finding something that had this storyline, that's something that we used to take advantage of in the past, and now actually we're finding that we can use it in all sorts of different things. I originally actually wanted to do my research on bamboo, because I lived in Southeast Asia, and I remember seeing these giant buildings with bamboo structures instead of you know, the iron cladding that you have now to get up the buildings. If all over China and Hong Kong, you just see bamboo with cable ties. Basically, that's what holds up any sort of construction. And then you saw bamboo as being used in food and clothing and all these other things. And I thought, well, isn't this great? This is a great project. And I ended up going to the UN Conference of Parties, so COP23, that was held in Bonn. And I met this Swedish scientist who had a seaweed farm and said, forget about bamboo, seaweed's the future. It's like, whatever you think you can do with a product, it's like seaweed can do it. You want a food, seaweed. You want a, you know, biostimulant, seaweed. You want a fabric, seaweed. It can do everything. And he convinced me that, okay. And I think, like a lot of people who get into seaweed, once you're in, you're in. It's almost like a cult, yeah.
I think a lot of people wouldn't realize. I think people listening that aren't aware of all the uses of seaweed, this will be news to them in terms of the range of uses for seaweed between products and then medicinal uses and then food as well. Why do you think it is, and especially I suppose in our culture, why do you think it hasn't kind of came to the fore, like up to the surface yet? Why is it maybe hidden a bit in a cult?
I mean, to be honest, this is the weird thing about it, because it was so ingrained at some point at various times throughout history. That's the most interesting thing about this. The further you delve into the history of seaweed, the more you actually know that we have this relationship with it. So, you know, we used to feed it to our animals in winter. We used to put it on our crops. So some people might know lazy bed farming, where you basically go up hills and dig out troughs and essentially put seaweed in those plots of land, and then basically put your seeds on top, and it gives them lots of nutrients through the seaweed. So it's a great form of utilizing it. And then, you know, during the First World War, we used the potash, and we burnt seaweed on the beaches, and we used that for gunpowder in the First World War. We also used it to make to bleach clothes, to make soap, to make glass, you know, all of these things that was really, really interesting. And then essentially what happened was the seaweed revolution, well, the industrial revolution came, and we stopped looking to the sea for all these things. We started mining it. And then obviously looked more to agriculture to develop everything, and lost all of our history and our relationship with the ocean and seaweed and all its uses. You know, at one point, Glasgow was the iodine capital of the world. We had loads of alginate factories around here that use seaweed, and you know, in the 80s they all sort of died away as well. And we're kind of reinvigorating that relationship now, but it's really hard when we have a complete generation who have had no relationship with seaweed whatsoever. You might still find some people's grandparents who, you know, remember eating dulse back in the day, or lava bread in Wales, which is still quite uncommon to actually eat on a day-to-day basis. But
yeah, it definitely has been a shift, and I imagine if you did a survey of students in where I am now in Belfast, like I'd say not many people would be aware of all this. But I was going to say as well, Rihanna, when we organised this chat, I kind of looked into the seaweed history around where I am now in Strangford Lough, and there's a series of islands, and I think there's old buildings, old stone buildings. They were used as kelp kilns and storage houses, and they're still on the islands. So the landscape, like the evidence is still there in the landscape of the historical use of it, which I found quite interesting. I don't know if it's similar up in Scotland. I'm sure it is, but yeah. So it's just kind of like a reminder of where it came from, like the almost back in the 200 years ago when I suppose like people needed food and they needed to grow food produce in fields, and they needed to do it as best as possible. So it's funny how just the shift, it's kind of went from a need to just now well, like you say, it's kind of turning into it's turning into don't know what I'm trying to say.
I mean, it's the seaweed revolution, but it's a completely different
exactly. It's kind of like
relationship we have now. Yeah, it's reinventing itself now.
Yeah.
Now we know it for its, you know, medicinal properties, and we know it for its nutritional properties, and you know, that's stuff that maybe we didn't quite understand before, but we knew that if you had a cut on your leg, you could wrap it in seaweed and it would heal it. Maybe we didn't quite know why. You know, I think when I delved into some of the literature, it wasn't until the 1800s that people actually understood what iodine was, and how useful it was for us. And you know, I've heard stories of in New Zealand, they used to chew on seaweed stipes when they were going along, basically, and in their boats. And that's one of the most interesting things, I think, is that seaweed we used to eat to give us, you know, vitamin C and other things like that. So when we actually got scurvy on the boats, the Norwegians and Scandinavians who used to go on vessels, they could go much further because they knew you could get the nutrients from the seaweed, whereas a lot of our explorers ended up dying from scurvy because they didn't understand that seaweed has the, you know, just above the water where all this seaweed was that could have saved them. And it's crazy to me that, yeah, you just lose that knowledge.
Yeah, just the seaweed floating on the water could have saved your life back in the day.
Yeah.
You mentioned about literature there, and your thesis you did during your master's, was it?
Yeah.
Can you? I absolutely love the title of it. Do you want to share with the listeners the title of the thesis?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I originally came up with this, Seaweed is Sexy, and it's about the consumption and utilization of seaweed throughout British history and its marketing journey. And when I first came up with that title, actually, the other people in my graduating class said, "You're not really going to call it that, are you?" And my supervisor said, "Yes, you absolutely are." So I kept it, and I'm quite happy I did, because I think it's a testament, really, to seaweed and what it represents now.
Yeah. So in your research, what did you conclude from it during your studies?
I think, well, essentially that seaweed is sexy, it's new, it has all of these really great properties that are just so useful for us in modern day life. And most of which because of its sustainability, really. It's lauded as the superfood. It can replace all sorts of products that we make out of oil and petroleum, so your plastics and products like that. So it's really, really great that we have this thing that actually we can get excited about and can do so much more for us. I think I probably focused quite a lot on my thesis on it being used as a food, and I think seaweed for food is really great. I eat seaweed every day, but I do use it as a seasoning, as just a small sprinkle to put in my food, just to, you know, give myself a bit of a health boost. I you know, do work a little bit with it in its vegetable form, but it is hard to understand it. It's just not something that we have quite in the diet yet. And I think maybe what I've realized between writing that thesis and now is that it's a lot more difficult to get people into eating seaweed than I had initially thought.
And in your document, there's a lot of literature. Was that done on? Was there a tactic behind having all that literature in the research? Like it's not scientific, so it's kind of more the looking into the culture of it and going back in time, and
it's a bit more anecdotal. Yeah. I felt like I got into a bit of a rabbit hole with it, because you started to find, you know, reports from people who would manage certain areas of land, and they would talk about, you know, kelp kilns, and they'd talk about how they used it, or you'd find documents about someone found, you know, a rock of seaweed, or had a certain area of the beach that had loads of seaweed in it, and then they would go to court. And you know, in Anstruther, I remember seeing a court case around basically a rock that was filled with seaweed, and that somebody wanted it for £4 or something. And it was just really, really interesting to find this and go, oh wow, right. So it was a really, really desirable product, and this industry. And you know, 100,000 people were employed in the Outer Hebrides. The more I delved into that, actually, the more I found out maybe not all of them were getting paid. So
Right.
you know,
Okay.
good and bad in all industries. But yeah, I just thought it was so interesting. So I tried to put as much sort of literature or anecdotal evidence as I could into that relationship, and why people, and even quotes, I think, from poetry and stories, because it really does have this relationship. And actually, even if you look into Scots Gaelic, the number of words that we have for seaweed, you know, when you talk about how you know, Inuits have 42 different words for snow, it's we have the same for seaweed in our foreign languages, and now it's pretty much just seaweed is the blanket term for all of the bountiful kind of different varieties of seaweed that you can find. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I think I was reading earlier, there's like over 100 types of kelp, seaweed, different variations.
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
10,000 different types of seaweed all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, you've got green, brown, and red, and the variety in them genetically, a red seaweed and a green seaweed are more diverse than we are from a sponge, you know, from a sea sponge. It's crazy how diverse they are really on the genetic tree.
Yeah. But me.
Just loads to think about, really.
Yeah, right.
Just makes you feel small.
And then you mentioned about 100,000 people were employed in, or maybe employed in the Outer Hebrides. I didn't realize the scale of when was that? When?
Yeah, so there was a kelp boom between the kind of mid 1700s to the early 1800s. So around that time, yeah, especially Lewis, Harris, Skye. If you go out to any of those islands, you'll find kelp kilns there still. So it's really interesting, actually, that history sort of remains. Even houses made out of seaweed. You had roofs made out of seaweed. So some of those practices still go on. It's really interesting to see. Yeah.
No, it sounds like the research is really interesting. But looking ahead, then, how do we make seaweed sexy? Like, how can you entice people to get on the train?
Yeah, I think there's two camps. I mean, if you live in the south of England, I feel like you're not going to think that seaweed's particularly sexy at the moment. There's loads of stories about it being washed up on the beaches, because we've got, and that's what's going to happen, actually. It's a really interesting point about eutrophication. You've got a lot of sewage runoff at the moment going on in the south of England, which means that you're going to get these big seaweed and algae blooms because there's an imbalance of nutrients in the water. And actually those kinds of things do contribute to dead zones. We've seen that in the Baltic Sea, and now in the Sargasso Sea as well. There's those giant seaweed blobs of sargassum that are moving into Mexico and California and those kinds of areas, Florida, sorry, and those kinds of areas. So I'm sure people in those areas would say, oh, it's definitely not sexy, and it's not in that instance. But what we can do is we can, you know, grow it and harvest it in a sustainable way. If it's washing up on the beach, there are things that we can do with it. And that's what's really exciting. So you can make t-shirts out of seaweed. We've got people now making fibers and producing clothing, which reduces the amount of water by so much, because the clothing industry is one of the biggest users of water anywhere. Same thing with dyes. You can now make dyes out of seaweed and significantly reduce the water there as well. Bioplastics that degrade in some cases less than 6 weeks, so you can literally just put it in your compost or throw it on the ground and it'll be fine. I think it's such an exciting sector, and every single day there's a different use for it. Recently I saw tampons as well, from Germany. And it is something that people are getting really excited about. But it's the hype, also the reality of it as well, because with that hype we then need regulations, we need money. It's really, really hard to compete with plastic, because plastic is so cheap and we're so used to it now. So how do we get rid of plastic and introduce something that's more expensive? Most people don't want to pay for that. So yeah, and getting it out there, the news helps a lot, I think. With every new development, there's so much interest and intrigue, and people are starting to see that, yeah, it really is sexy.
And I suppose it's like you say, some people will view it as maybe, if there is people with seaweed washing up on the beach, it's decomposing, smelly, it's kind of changing people's perception. So instead of saying, well, this is a problem, like, why not take this stuff, turn it into fertilizer for agriculture or something? I don't know, something. It's kind of like changing that perspective. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, you're seeing now some people are taking the sargassum and making it into building blocks, I think I saw the other day. So fortifying, or trying to replace cement, or even fortifying cement. All of those things are really great, because again, cement has a huge carbon output. So if we can take something and reduce carbon simultaneously, well, then that's great. Equally, if you use it in animal feed and human food, and you can't use the stuff that washes up on the beach for that, because it won't be food safe, but the stuff that you grow, or the stuff that you hand harvest, you can use that for food and animal feed, and significantly reduce maybe some of the ingredients that you're using, in terms of their carbon output, and then making the whole life cycle analysis that much better. And I think that's something that a lot of people are looking at right now. There's a huge interest to reduce carbon everywhere, and so if we can do that with the help of seaweed, with reduced carbon products, and that's great as well.
Yeah, I was also reading about initiatives growing seaweed, taking it out to the sea where the water's deeper than a kilometre, and burying it for carbon mitigation, which I read it, and the skeptic in me goes, who's paying for it? But have you heard of things like that?
Yeah, and I would be very, very skeptical about that. I mean, ultimately, if you're growing it and then sinking it, the carbon that you're sequestering in growing it and then dumping it would be almost immediately undone by taking it out far enough. If you think about how far you have to get to a 1,000 meters, so you have to drop it to 1,000 meters, and then how are you dropping it as well? What the methods of it? Are you tying a stone to it, because then that's more cement, or if you're using some kind of machinery to then take it down? So if you're growing it yourself, the root is definitely not sinking it. It's just not worth it, and we don't know what effect it'll have on the seabed either. If we've learned anything, it's that ecosystems are fragile, and the more we mess with them and don't know about the effect that they have, the worse it is, really.
Humans are pretty good at disrupting the balance, aren't they, and changing something and knock-on effects. So no, it's a good point. Actually, I didn't even think about the logistics of even towing the stuff out to sea and dumping it. Like, you have all that stuff and just takes away from the net benefit, I suppose. So but anyway, so all in all, there's so many uses for seaweed. My head hurts kind of trying to think of all the different things. And but anyway, so the blue economy in Scotland, the seaweed industries, obviously the work you're doing at the minute is trying to regenerate it and make it grow. So what sort of things are happening in Scotland to start that?
So we've got quite a few different things happening. So we've got independent farmers are trying to set up farms now and see how that goes. It's interesting because everyone's got their own sort of engineering challenges and biological challenges. You know, everyone has, especially I suppose, economic challenges with this. It's really hard to make seaweed farming economically viable right now, and I think a lot of people are aware of that. And you know, I think it's really important to be as knowledgeable as possible before we go into this. But on that respect, from that respect, they're able to then share their experiences, and the more knowledge that we have and share, the easier it is for every iteration, because every aquaculture industry goes through peaks and troughs, and we're no different, especially because it's such a new industry. So yeah, so we've got people farming, we've got people doing processing and trying to figure out processing, and that's its own challenge, because you can't just use a seed or grain dryer, because seaweed has its own composition. You know, it has alginates in it, it's got sugars in it, it's going to stick, it's going to do things you wouldn't expect. As it dries, obviously it's got 90% water. You maybe want to retain 10% of the water, so it's getting it to the right water activity level so that it's food safe. All these other things. So we've got some processors trying to figure that out. We've got some farmers trying to figure out the farming side. And then we've got people doing the value add. So you've got the likes of Oceanium looking at different products that you can make out of seaweed, and then trying to figure out which ones are financially viable. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, is finding that route to market, something that is going to drive the demand for seaweed, because if we're supplying seaweed and there's no demand, then that's where we're going to come to a head. So it's chicken and egg at the moment. Do we need the demand or do we need the supply? And yeah,
everyone needs to work together very closely, Ben, I imagine. A lot
yeah,
of communication, collaboration,
which
is
is what
easy.
I'm trying to do there. That's what the SSIA is all about, right? We're driving and fostering that collaboration and that unity, and trying to create a kind of seaweed community.
And if someone wanted to get into this industry and start a seaweed farm, what would they do and how easy is it?
Probably a lot harder than you think, to be honest. I mean, the best thing that you can do really is you know, go on a course or read up on it, or just try and get as much information as possible. That's why, you know, the Seaweed Academy was started in the first place, and actually running it at SAMS, what I found was the majority of people going on it weren't necessarily farmers, but people who wanted to perhaps participate in some part of the value chain. And the easier that you can, you know, find out the value chain and find out what the bottlenecks are, the easier it'll be to open those up and really try and unlock the potential, I suppose. So yeah, so educate yourself is the very first thing. And I would say get funding, make sure that you have enough funding, because that's always going to be an issue. Timeframes are never going to be what you expect them to be. You have to start your farm, and then there'll be pushbacks. Whoever your regulatory bodies are, they'll probably take a lot longer than you expect, if you were going into the farming, of course. And then, you know, then you need a good engineer, you need to do trials, you need to know that where you're putting your seaweed is a good spot for it to grow. Different species like different environments, they like different currents. You know, you want a place that's sheltered enough, but also has enough current to move nutrients around and not be affected by fresh water. So, you know, loads of things to consider, a lot to put together and get your head around. And then most of all is, who are you going to sell it to? If you're growing or harvesting seaweed, where are you sending it to? And then on the flip side, if you're then doing, you know, value add processing, you're making your products, great, where are you going to get your seaweed from? Is it going to be local? Are you going to try and reduce the amount of carbon as possible, because then you're probably going to have to pay more? Or are you going to import it from other countries where it's a lot cheaper, but the quality is probably not going to be as good and your carbon output's going to be higher? So those are all the things to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, a big balancing act. You're mentioning about the ideal conditions for growing seaweed. I imagine Scotland's pretty good for it, with the locks, the numerous locks, the tides, and reasonably sheltered, depending on the direction of winds.
Yeah, I think sheltering is more of an engineering challenge than anything else. The further out you are, the bigger an engineering task it's going to be, because we do get some pretty rocky waters in the winter, and kelp, which is what most people grow because the biomass is so much higher, is a winter crop, which is great for industries like fishing, that this is their off season, so you can use the workforce, or you can use some of the equipment. But yeah, the seaweed does like lots of nutrients, so you need an area that has a lot of current, and having it a bit further out is ideal for those growing conditions, but maybe not necessarily for your workforce or for your mooring. So Scotland is a great place for it. We've got great cold waters, kelp's like 10 degrees and lower. Any more than that and you're in a bit of a risky area. With the warming waters as well, and climate change, this area is going to start being driven further and further north, which is a difficult balancing act as well. And you also have such nutrient rich waters. Even the salmon industry has lots of nitrogen outputs, which means that seaweed actually really, really likes it, because it absorbs nitrogen, it absorbs phosphorus, it absorbs potassium, and everything that we really need, and that's why it's such a great food product and such a great fertilizer.
That's interesting about the you mentioned about the fishing during the off season, the kelp seasons during the winter, during the off season for fishermen. Is there collaboration between different aquaculture industries then, or is there potential for it? For example, I'm thinking of maybe oyster beds, oyster fishermen, mussels, people growing this. Can they like merge all this into like one enterprise, or would it have to be like just seaweed, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, what you're describing there is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, or IMTA.
That's the word I was looking for.
That's it, yeah.
Our words.
Yeah. So yeah, those IMTA systems, that was first coined by Thierry Chopin, who is a researcher over in North America, basically. And the whole concept is that you can have multiple forms of aquaculture next to each other. And in an ideal setup world, we'd have a fish farm in the middle of a seaweed farm next to a mussel, an oyster farm, and then you'd have underneath your filter feeders. Those would be your filter feeders, so absorbing the organic nitrogen and particulate matter. That would be what happens with your mussels and other bivalves. And you've got your seaweed with all the inorganic matter. It would be absorbing anything that's dissolved as well. And then on the seabed, you'd have things like cucumbers and urchins and worms that would then take up anything that's then fallen onto the floor. So in this ideal world, we'd have a really synergistic environment and higher growth rates all round. In practice, it's obviously quite difficult to do that. The biggest challenge, I would say, is the fact that if you have all of those things together, you need to make sure that everything's profitable. And at the moment, fish is a lot more profitable than bivalves, and bivalves are still more profitable than seaweed. So what you probably end up finding is that seaweed would fall to the wayside in preference for these other species. But if we can co-locate them and have them near to one another but separately managed, that's a potential solution for that. And actually, yeah, we'll find that it's actually doing really good all around.
Yeah, I always wondered, the offshore energy industry as well. I always wonder if there's potential to get involved. Maybe it's completely far-fetched, but all these structures going offshore, if there's any way to get aquaculture involved in these sites, but maybe that's completely
it's not as far-fetched as you think. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest from both sides. I think trials need to be done. We need to figure out exactly how they interact, because obviously if you're looking at offshore wind, they're not going to want any sort of hindrance to the structure. You wouldn't want anything being blocked off. But again, that's an ideal situation. If you can build a solid enough structure that can withstand out there, it's already a no catch zone, so you're not upsetting anybody. in the fishing sector by blocking it off with other activities. So actually it's a win-win if we can make it happen, but again, needs to be economically viable. If you're going out there and saying, well, I'm going to put seaweed farms here, but it's not going to make any money, what's the point?
The communities that are getting involved in this are I'm thinking of the coastal communities around the UK and Ireland. What do you think this will play a big role in the future for these communities, this industry, in terms of employment and like I'm thinking of maybe, well, for example, the seaweed industry used to be big and now it's gone. Do you think it'll come back for these communities?
I mean, there's potential, yeah. It definitely is something that a lot of coastal communities, I mean, it's really unfortunate because coastal communities are really struggling at the moment. But the main reason, and I might be controversial here by saying this, I don't think I am, I think a lot of people will agree with me, but essentially tourism is killing these rural areas. Because even if you do have jobs in these areas, the housing is not available, and if it is, it's far too expensive because everything's being bought up for Airbnb and second homes, driving the price up and making it unlivable. So you do have jobs in these rural areas on fish farms and fishing communities, and the expectation a lot of the time has to be for these industries that they provide their own housing, which seems completely ridiculous. So you're getting, you know, places like Ullapool, Fort William, they're just turning into shell towns and in the winter especially, you'll go up there and there's nobody there because you know, the hospitality shuts down for the winter. You've only got a few locals still remaining there. So I'd love to say, yeah, the seaweed industry is going to bring this back, but really it's a housing issue more than anything else. And I think that's happening all over.
Yeah. We were in Cornwall there for 4 weeks ago. There was a sailing event down in Cornwall, staying in an Airbnb, and I know there's issues down there. And back home here, we have the north coast of Northern Ireland. If you go up in winter time, it's probably getting better in the sense that there's probably tourism all year round, but there's probably summer's a peak period, and then we have Donegal on the west side as well, where you go up in winter and it's you'd maybe get Donegal busy for 1 week over the 12th of July holidays here. And I get where you're coming from, where it's not, if it's tourism, it has to be sustainable tourism, and is that sustainable tourism? I don't know.
No, exactly. I think that's difficulty. I mean, even in Oban, the population of Oban in the summer is 27,000. In the winter, it's 8,000. You know, there's a huge difference, and you see it. There's traffic. There's all these other things, but it's kind of a depressing place in the winter. So yeah, you know, it's just one of those things.
It is one of those things because it's driven by school holidays, the weather, you know, it's just but yeah, it has consequences for coastal communities at the end of the day. So yeah, it's interesting. The coastal communities are definitely, I think, especially the rural ones, are getting, it's tough. So
the other thing as well, I suppose, with that as well, is that the biggest question is what is meaningful employment. I think what people are missing these days, especially Gen Z and everything else, you know, we're there going, what is defined as meaningful employment? Because a lot of the jobs that are going are in hospitality, are in tourism, and they're not considered meaningful employment. So working on a seaweed farm might be, but again, the pay is not going to be that much better than working in hospitality, and the work is going to be significantly harder. So it needs to be meaningful, it needs to pay well, and those are challenges for any new sector at the moment. And you know, cost of living crisis isn't really helping anything either. So it's hard. So you know, I equally, even with working in seaweed, I'm positive most of the time, but at times I really do feel quite down about it, because there are so many external factors that are affecting where we are and what we can do. across the whole country, across all countries really.
I think people in the environmental industry in general have that issue, ups and downs. It's just the nature of the work. But anyway, moving on. Something a bit more. Well, I was going to ask about comparing. If you look around the rest of the world, like maybe Asia and the Americas, is there any lessons you can learn from other blue economies that are maybe a bit more mature? I don't know if that's right to say, but maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Americas are probably about the same state that we're in. Having talked with them, I think they're equally finding similar issues. But if there's anything that I've learned from looking at Asia, it's that actually collaborative, cooperative models are really, really useful, especially if we're looking at economies of scale, if we're looking at operational risks as well. I think, this whole supply and demand issue can be resolved if we have a cohesive and cooperative way of looking at this, and really that's the way to move forward. In China, you will see, or at least in South Korea, a lot of the seaweed that they grow ends up going straight to abalones. So you've got kelp farms and then you've got abalone farms next to them, and essentially 40% of that kelp is then immediately dropped into the abalone cages for them to eat, which is really interesting because it's a higher value product.
Sorry, what are abalones? Are they fish?
No, they're shellfish. So they're little,
Shellfish?
like if you've ever seen in a fish tank the little shells that stick to the side.
Oh, right, okay.
So yeah, that very popular food in Asia, not that popular here, and now people do love seaweed snacks over here. It's great, but it's a species called nori, which is porphyra, which is the same actually species as lava bread, and actually that's just a testament to how we eat things and how the Asians process and eat things. We found this seaweed and we went, what should we do with it? Let's boil it for hours. And mix it with oats and butter. And they found it and they said, well, let's flatten it and let's steam it and let's dry it out and make it into this crispy delicious sheet. And the difference is wild. You don't see anyone out there boiling seaweed and going, this is delicious, but we will eat the sheets of seaweed and we'll put it in sushi and everything else. So sometimes it's just about the way that we approach how we eat things and what we do with it. But it's definitely seen as a kind of Asian cosmopolitan idea of what we eat and not necessarily as integrated into our culture as maybe should be.
Yeah, we do like our processed foods here, don't we? Yeah.
But again, it's a story of how we incorporate things. We could still process it and put it into foods if we want. I mean, you will see seaweed you probably consume seaweed every day without even realizing. You've got seaweed as basically as a stabilizer in so many foods. If you're eating cooked meats, it's probably in that, in toothpaste, in beer, in all sorts of different products like soy milk, and it's an emulsifier, it's a stabilizer. And for those reasons it's great, but again, those are species of seaweed that you grow in Indonesia and in the Philippines. It's not UK based seaweed.
So I think I have two more questions, Rihanna, and then I'll let you go. But my mind has been blown, and I think most people listening to this, their mind will be blown with the amount of stuff happening in the seaweed industry. For anyone listening who just perhaps I suppose they view themselves as a potential consumer, like what would be, I suppose, just starting to look at products locally, how would they be able to get involved and support the industry if they wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, there are products around, especially I would say in whole food shops. So if you're looking at anything related to health food shops, sorry, if you go in there, you'll usually be able to find Irish musk or carrageenan. That's always been used as a thickening agent to make jellies. You can find agar, that's seaweed. You can also buy seaweed in seasonings and powders. So if you look up Mara Seaweed, who have now been taken over, Seaweed Enterprises, or Shore Crisps. The Shore actually started coming out with, they've got pesto, they've got crisps, and they've also got some seaweed broths. So that's a great way to consume it in small amounts that maybe are a bit more palatable to the Western diet. If you get the seaweed sachets from Mara, they're a little bit more kind of a seasoning product. Or even just go down to the beach. I'd recommend going to the beach, actually looking at the different seaweeds, trying them. There's no poisonous seaweed in the UK or in Ireland. So if you go around, you know, I would say don't eat too much because it's got high levels of iodine in it and you don't want to give yourself hypothyroidism. But, you know, go have a taste and see what the different flavors are. And you know, cook it up, dry it, see what happens to it. That's how we discover food in the first place. That's how we figure out what we like and what we don't like.
Yeah, experiment. And yeah, I'm glad we're not recommending any dangerous practice by anyone's going to end up poisoned by seaweed. That's good. Always a positive. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think people will want, I think, even just out of curiosity, I think, and that's how it'll start. If people hear about it, try it, and then take it from there. So Rihanna, for the outlook for yourself with the Scottish Seaweed Industry Association, is there any big events planned, upcoming events, or anything you want to promote?
Yeah, we've got the conference, the Scottish Seaweed Industry Association conference is coming back for the first time since 2020. So COVID break, now we're finally coming back to Scotland. So it's going to be held in Oban from the 14th to the 16th of November, which is really exciting. It's all about best practices this year. So we're looking at, you know, what we need to consider when we're looking at health and safety, when we're looking at the effect on the marine environment, what can seaweed bring, you know, regulatory considerations, and also we've got people coming from Canada, we've got people coming from Norway to come and talk about it too. So it's just a really exciting space to actually share some information and network more than anything else. I think an opportunity for people in UK and nearby countries to come and actually have chats and get to know each other in person. Which is you know, so exciting that we can actually do it again.
Absolutely. So you can register on the website. Is that the best place?
Yeah. So go on the website. We've got tickets on there, and check it out.
Very good. Awesome. Well, Rihanna, it's been amazing chatting to you. Actually, hearing what you do and the amount of potential and work going on in the industry. My head's actually a wee bit sore. All these different thoughts were flying around my head when you were speaking, and I was like, oh, but there we are. That's I think that's what makes it exciting. So and I'm glad you're here to steer me and not go off on a tangent. So
that's it's been a pleasure. Yeah, I love talking about seaweed and sharing the information. So I hope I've been able to bring at least a little bit of knowledge and intrigue and everything to you and also to your listeners. So
you absolutely have. Absolutely have. So thanks so much for coming on the Coastal Catch-Ups, Rihanna. And I'll chat to you soon, I'm sure.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for listening to Coastal Catch-Ups, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please remember to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on the website at www.coastalcatchups.com. I'll see you at the next episode.